Hi guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video I'm very excited for because it's going to be a fantasy recommendation style video, but not just any fantasy. That's right, friends. Today we're going to be chatting through some underrated fantasy reads. Now, I love reading a hyped fantasy read just like the next person. I want to see what all the buzz is about. I want to see what people are talking about. That being said though, there are so many amazing fantasy novels that fly under the radar and just aren't as popular as I think they should be. So with that in mind, I have a variety of books here today to recommend to you that I think are worth not only much more hype than they already have, but just in general are criminally underrated. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. The first book I'm going to recommend was actually a very recent read, and I got this recommendation from one of my favorite fantasy booktubers, which is Elliot, and I'll have her channel linked down below. But the book is The Ninth Reign by Jen Williams. I can earnestly say that this is one of the most unique fantasy books I've ever read, while also housing to some of my favorite fantasy tropes of all time. This is a quest-centered fantasy story that sort of follows an unexpected ragtag group of individuals who work alongside each other as they venture out into the wilderness to try to unlock the secret history of a long-dead enemy. More specifically, we follow basically a vampire character who is just as sassy and well-dressed as you would want him to be. We also follow kind of an archaeologist who's sort of spearheading this investigation of that long-dead enemy. And lastly, a runaway witch who has the ability to control fire. And again, they're all working alongside each other and sort of getting pulled into a much larger conspiracy that's beginning to balloon out of control. So many things about this book work so well. First and foremost, the characters are so likable, and you're following each of their individual stories, unpacking their past, trying to understand their motivations, and more so enjoying the camaraderie and humor and interactions they have amongst each other is just so good. Two, this world is so unique. This author is pulling in so many different fantasy influences that feel like they should not work together at all, but they just do perfectly. Again, vampire-esque character, witch character, like there's so much happening, and even this sort of mysterious enemy from the past has this sort of alien quality to it. There's high fantasy elements, there's a steampunk nod. Again, there's just so many different things going on, creating such a unique package and experience. I loved this story. I love quests, I love mysteries, and most of all, I love unlikely characters, you know, having a found family situation, and this has all of that. Another book that I feel like is super underrated, especially because I feel like this author's other series is quite popular, is The Hexologist by Josiah Bancroft. Josiah Bancroft also wrote Senlin Ascends, which is also one of my most favorite fantasy series. It's also highly unique, and I would say Josiah Bancroft's flair for writing an unusual tale definitely shines within this book too. This is a story that almost sort of reads like serialized fiction. It's set in this sort of industrial fantasy world where there's different schools of magic, and all of these schools are now sort of deeply controlled by their larger government in place, and innovation and technology is sort of taking center stage, very much at the expense of the everyday person. It kind of gives like magical industrial revolution vibes. In this story, we're introduced to a husband and wife team, and they're basically like detectives for hire. They take on unusual magical cases for pay, and the wife herself is actually a very talented hexologist. This book is so quirky and weird. I love the character interactions between the husband and wife. I love their humor. I love their solutions to get out of various problems that they find themselves in. The story itself is really, really compelling too. It basically opens up with the royal family coming to their door, begging them for their help because the king is trying to bake himself into a cake. Generally speaking, they're anti-monarchist, but they decide to take on the case for the sake of civility, and obviously things get really complicated from there. It has a twisty and turny plot. I love the mystery, and again, I feel like I could read like 1,000 books just following these two characters. That's sort of why I feel like it has a serialized feel to it. The magic system was so interesting. The world was interesting. There was also some great commentary sort of folded into the plot overall. The characters really rooted the story so well, and I was flipping the pages. I want so many more books in this series following these characters. I had a blast reading this. Another book I feel like is pretty underrated and also perfect for the upcoming season is The Library of the Dead by T.L. Huchu. This is a really fun sort of middle grade meets adult fantasy story. I say that because our main protagonist in the story is a young girl, but the story itself is rather dark and intense. So there's definitely an interesting combination of things in regards to the plot setup that I feel like personally works so well. This fantasy story is set kind of in an alternate fantasy version of our world, in the way that the world itself is much darker, much more intense, much more dangerous to live in, and also there are supernatural elements of it too, including the existence of ghosts and just an entire industry that centers around the communication and working alongside these ghosts and supernatural creatures. We're introduced to our main character in the story. Her name is Ropa, and Ropa dropped out of school to basically survive another day, and she makes a living by basically chatting with ghosts and helping to pass on their final message to their family. It's a dangerous job. It's one that she does completely under the table, so she's always trying to kind of keep out of the eye of people in charge. The story itself takes place in Edinburgh, which truly provides the perfect spooky backdrop for everything that occurs within this story. And something begins to happen at the beginning of this book where in which children begin to disappear and then come back to their families as husks of their former selves, and no one really want to look too deeply into what's happening. And Ropa decides to figure out what's going on herself, which sort of gets her stuck in a very dangerous situation and closer to the seedy underbelly of this city. It's intense, it's mysterious. Ropa as a main character is so endearing and likable. She is so determined and focused, and honestly, no one can tell her to do something that she doesn't want to do. I feel like she roots the story wonderfully. She also provides so much humor. I love being in her head. I love following her as she's moving through this world and story. Again, it has that perfect creepy ambiance, and the ghost element just makes it a perfect fall read. I feel like more people should be reading this book. It also has multiple books out now. I'm personally going to be checking out some of the later books in the series this fall, but if you haven't read it yet, add it to your TBR. Another book that I feel like is criminally underrated is The Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez. This is one of my favorite fantasy books I've ever read. It's also probably one of the most unique fantasy books I've ever read, and it was just so successful in its construction, its storytelling quality, and just like what it was trying to achieve overall. I feel like everyone should read this. Like, this is a required reading if you ask me. Like, it is just so good. With that in mind, if it's not on your TBR yet, it definitely should be, but this is a layered storytelling experience. It is a written story that's trying to mimic and represent the art of oral storytelling. In it, we're introduced first to our main character as he's sitting in the kitchen of his grandmother as she recounts to him the history of their people, this impossible feat that happened many, many, many generations ago, but then the story sort of begins to fold into itself, and we now follow our main character as he begins to share this story too. And then we also follow our main character as he's sitting within a magical theater, experiencing the story unfold in front of his very eyes. And as a reader, we're reading all of these different narrators, but also reading the story firsthand ourselves. And the story is such a beautiful, mesmerizing thing. And it also is very much a love story too. It is a story that follows two young men as they break out a desperate god from the clutches of an evil empire who's using this god to maintain their power. And from there, they're running and escaping across the land to try to deliver this god to safety. All the while, they're pursued by many different individuals pursuing power themselves. It's so intense. It will keep you on the edge of your seat. And the characters are so compelling, both past and present. And how the storytelling experience becomes so intertwined as you're reading it is just exceptionally done. I earnestly can say, again, I have never read anything quite like this book before, and I really don't feel like I'm going to read anything like it ever again. It was a masterpiece, and more people need to read it. The next book I have is actually a romantasy recommendation, and I just feel like romantasy reads are constantly going viral, and I've read many of them, and I generally feel like I leave the experience feeling disappointed. But with this book, I was hooked, I was entertained, and I also really appreciated the balance that the author struck between the fantasy components of the story and the romance. And the book I'm talking about is the Jad Air by Sarah Heisem. This is also a true enemies to lovers story where the two characters truly despise each other at the core of their beings, and yet they're inexplicably drawn to one another, and the tension and the self-hatred and the confusion that exists within this scenario is really well played out as well, and I just ate this book up. This story is set in a fantasy world that was comprised of many different kingdoms that all sort of had a balance of power, if you will. Aside from the fact that one of these kingdoms, the Jad Kingdom, was incredibly powerful, and they were able to be so powerful because they had magic. And 10 years prior to the start of this novel, all the kingdoms sort of attacked this one kingdom and burned it to the ground, and also killing everyone in the royal family, or so they think, because our main character Sylvia is actually a descendant of this royal family, and she is has been in hiding her entire life ever since this moment. Ever since the overthrow of the Jad Kingdom, magic has also been outlawed entirely within this land, and hiding or possessing magic is an incredibly dangerous thing because there are guards who are trying to find you and local people who might rat you out to authorities. It's a very dangerous and difficult life to live, which is why Sylvia has spent most of her life moving from town to town, sort of refusing to make any close relationships because she always needs to keep so much of herself guarded to protect herself. Things get especially complicated though when the Jad Air comes into town looking for a champion to participate in this like larger political competition. And the Jad Kingdom basically rose to power after the destruction of the Jad Kingdom because they're kind of the overseers and the keeper of balance between the politics of the land. And now Sylvia has to contend with this heir Aaron who's in town, and he basically seeks her out because he gets a feeling that she's like really powerful, so he picks her to be his champion within this competition. They begin training, there's lots of secrets, they detest each other but they're drawn to one another. It was just so delicious. I won't lie, there's aspects of this book that weren't perfect. The pacing was a bit inconsistent, and I would say some of the book felt rushed, especially towards the end, but I will say with my full chest that the characterization in this book was so entertaining. Aaron and Sylvia rooted the story so well. I was obsessed with reading through both of their perspectives. The tension and back and forth was great. I flew through this. It's like one of those things where I'm like, yes, objectively, some aspects of it were not perfect, but I also feel like I'm a little bit nitpicky when it comes to romantasy at the end of the day, and I can say I was so thoroughly entertained with reading this book. The next book I have to recommend is actually a sci-fi story. I'm sneaking in a little sci-fi recommendation within my fantasy video. I hope you will not mind. But the book is The Deep Sky by Yumi Kitasai. I am obsessed with this book, and I feel like more people need to be reading it. It is the perfect intersection of like literary fiction, sci-fi, and thriller. It was unputdownable from a plot point of view, but also had such interesting like introspective character moments. I was just in love with this. The writing style, the idea of everything, it just all landed and worked so well for me. This book is set on the eve of Earth's collapse, and all of humanity sort of came together to put together this space program in which they picked 80 people to represent Earth, put them all in a spaceship, and sent them out into space. And that's where we're introduced to our main character, Asuka. And Asuka is self-conscious because one, she was picked as an alternate to be a part of this mission. She doesn't really have a specific job on the ship, and this also sort of feeds into her larger insecurities about her own place within the world, within her own culture, amongst her own people, and this type of thing. Something happens though shortly into the journey, which is a sabotage event resulting in the death of 3 crew members on the ship, and nobody knows who did it, and everyone is now a suspect. It's now up to our main character to figure out who the culprit was. This book takes place both in present day as this crime and event has taken place, in this sort of very tense countdown to try to solve the murder of what occurred on the ship. But we also follow back in time to follow our main character as a child as she gets selected for this prestigious program, and now she begins to work and train alongside all of these people on this ship. Because a large part of the tension of this book is everyone on the ship is like a very close-knit family. They all grew up amongst each other. So even coming to terms with the fact that somebody was willing to put the others in danger is a really hard thing to overcome, and also just creates a level of intensity I cannot understate. I was hooked in the mystery and the tension in the sci-fi world, and this sort of introspection our main character has as she's working through her own identity, how all of these things interplay with one another. I ate this book up. I think I read it in like 24 hours. So good. And the last book I'm going to show off, I feel like I talk about ad nauseum on my channel, but when I was checking on Goodreads, the first book in this series only has 10,000 reviews, which is simply unacceptable. It just wrapped up. Every book was amazing. I want everyone to check out this series because it was truly a knockout from beginning to end. And that series is the Empire of Wolf series by Richard Swan. The first one being The Justice of Kings. I am really not lying when I say every book in this series got better and better and better as I read along. I was deeply connected to the characters. The plot constantly took me by surprise. The world that the author created was fascinating. The writing style was so good, and the dialogue and the moralizing of everything that was happening was excellent too. Like, this series needs more praise, needs more hype. More people need to check this out, please. But if you're not familiar, the Empire of Wolf series is basically set in an empire where the emperor rules through individuals called justices. Justices can basically roam the land and act as judge, jury, and executioner executioner, the laws of the emperor. And in this story, we're introduced to a really powerful justice named Sir Conrad von Volt, but the story is not told from his point of view, but instead his young female apprentice, and she's actually writing the events of this entire trilogy from the future retrospectively, creating so many levels of like dramatic irony, really interesting humor and reflection as you go along. But we're basically watching our main characters take on what feels like a very straightforward case of aristocratic corruption in a small town, but slowly as they sort of tease out that there's actually a large political conspiracy centering a group of very powerful religious figures in this world, attempted coup and an absolute overrun of the empire itself, and it is wild. It is so wild, and I can only say that the action, adventure, character dynamics get better and better and better and better. There's also a lot of religious horror in this. I mean, honestly, it has it all, and every book is good. It's a trilogy that's worth reading, please. Alrighty guys, those are some severely underrated fantasy and one sci-fi books that I just highly recommend. Please let me know down below some books you think are underrated, as I would love to know, and I will see you soon with another video soon. Goodbye!